Brandon Miller had always been the adventurous type. Growing up in Denver, Colorado, he had spent most of his childhood exploring the nearby Rocky Mountains, hiking with his family, and camping with friends. But college life had a way of slowing down even the most active adventurer. Now, as a sophomore at the University of Denver, Brandon found himself buried under books, assignments, and exams. His friends, too, were caught up in the grind of campus life. But the longing for escape never left him. He craved the fresh air, the freedom of wide-open spaces, and the thrill of discovering the unknown. It was during one of his rare study breaks that Brandon first stumbled upon Misty Ridge. Scrolling through a local travel blog, he saw a picture of a charming mountain town nestled between jagged cliffs and thick pine forests. The writer raved about its peaceful atmosphere, historic Main Street, and scenic hiking trails. But what caught Brandon's attention the most was a passing mention of the town's eerie folklore. According to the blog, Misty Ridge was home to a number of ghost stories, tales passed down through generations of locals, of spirits still haunting the quiet streets and forests. For Brandon, the combination of natural beauty and the supernatural was irresistible. His friends, however, were less enthused. "Come on, dude. We've got midterms next week." His roommate Ryan groaned when Brandon suggested the trip. "It's a bad time for everyone, man," another friend added. "Maybe over winter break?" But Brandon wasn't willing to wait. He had been cooped up for too long, and the thought of being alone in the mountains was too appealing to pass up. So, he decided to go solo. It wasn't his first solo trip, and it wouldn't be his last. Within a day, Brandon had booked a room at a guest house just below Main Street and reserved a spot on the overnight bus to Aspen. From there, he would catch a shuttle to Misty Ridge. The trip was set for the upcoming weekend. The journey itself was uneventful. Brandon had taken an overnight bus before, and the ride to Aspen was smooth. He slept most of the way, waking up just as the bus began to climb the winding mountain roads. Outside his window, the peaks of the Rockies loomed large, their snow-capped tips gleaming in the early morning light. In Aspen, he grabbed a quick breakfast and waited for the shuttle to Misty Ridge. It wasn't a long ride, just over an hour, but the road was narrow and winding, with steep drop-offs that made Brandon grateful he wasn't driving. As they approached Misty Ridge, the town appeared almost suddenly, nestled in a valley between towering cliffs. It was small and quiet, just as the blog had described. Brandon's guest house was a modest, two-story building with a wooden sign hanging over the entrance that read, Misty Ridge Lodge. The owner, a friendly middle-aged man named Tom, greeted him with a smile and showed him to his room. "We don't get too many solo travelers," Tom remarked as he handed Brandon the key. "Most people come in groups or couples, but I guess you're here for the peace and quiet?" "Yeah, something like that," Brandon replied, not bothering to mention his interest in the town's ghost stories just yet. The room was small but comfortable, with a large window that offered a view of the forest behind the guest house. After unpacking his things, Brandon freshened up and headed downstairs to rent a bike. He had 3 days to explore, and he planned to make the most of it. The first stop on his list was Main Street. It was a short ride from the guest house, and as Brandon pedaled up the narrow road, he couldn't help but admire the old-fashioned charm of the town. The buildings were a mix of rustic cabins and Victorian-style homes, with wooden signs hanging above the shops and cafes. There were a few tourists walking around, but the town was far from crowded. Brandon parked his bike at the edge of Main Street and began to explore on foot. He wandered into a small coffee shop, ordered a latte, and took a seat by the window. Outside, the street sloped upwards, leading to an overlook that promised stunning views of the valley below. Brandon made a mental note to check it out later. After finishing his coffee, he spent the next few hours wandering the town, popping into local shops and chatting with the friendly shopkeepers. Everyone he met seemed eager to share stories about the town's history, and Brandon listened intently, hoping someone would mention the ghost stories. But no one did. It wasn't until later that evening, when the streets had emptied and the shops had closed, that Brandon began to sense something different about the town. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the street, a strange stillness settled over Misty Ridge. The once bustling Main Street was now eerily quiet, and Brandon felt a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the mountain breeze. He decided to grab dinner at a small diner on the edge of town. The place was cozy, with wooden booths and a warm fireplace. Brandon ordered a burger and fries, and as he ate, he noticed the time, 10 p.m. The diner was nearly empty, and outside, the streets were completely deserted. Finishing his meal, Brandon paid the bill and stepped outside. The air was colder now, and the streetlights cast long, flickering shadows across the pavement. He started walking back to the guest house, his breath visible in the cool night air. As he walked, the silence of the town became more oppressive. There was no sound except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. No cars, no voices, nothing. Brandon quickened his pace, eager to get back to the warmth of his room. But as he turned a corner, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A woman was walking ahead of him, her figure illuminated by the faint glow of a distant streetlight. She was carrying a large bundle of sticks on her back, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked to be in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, and her hair was hidden beneath a dark scarf tied tightly around her head. Brandon hesitated for a moment. It was unusual to see someone out so late, especially in a town as small and quiet as Misty Ridge. But something about the woman's slow, deliberate pace intrigued him. He decided to catch up with her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out as he approached. "Do you need any help with that?" The woman stopped and turned to look at him. Her face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her eyes seemed to glint in the dim light. She gave him a small, tight-lipped smile. "Thank you, but I'm fine," she replied in a voice that was soft and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. Brandon wasn't convinced. The bundle of sticks looked heavy, and the woman seemed to be struggling with the weight. "It's no trouble, really. I can help you carry them," he insisted. The woman stared at him for a moment, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or sadness. Then she nodded slowly. "If you insist," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon took the bundle of sticks from her, surprised by how light they felt. As they walked together down the narrow road, the woman remained silent, her eyes fixed on the ground. Brandon tried to make small talk, asking her where she was headed and why she was out so late, but she answered only in short, vague sentences. "I'm just going home," she said at one point. "I live just down the hill." Something about her tone sent a shiver down Brandon's spine, but he brushed it off. It was probably just the cold night air and the eerie stillness of the town getting to him. As they walked, the road became narrower and more isolated. The buildings thinned out, replaced by dense trees and shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The only sound was the soft crunch of their footsteps on the gravel road. Brandon glanced at the woman out of the corner of his eye. She was walking slowly, her head down, and her face was obscured by the scarf. For a moment, he wondered if she was lost or if something was wrong, but he didn't want to pry. After all, it wasn't his place to ask personal questions of a stranger. Eventually, they reached a small clearing where the road forked in two directions. The woman stopped and turned to face him. "This is where I leave you," she said quietly, holding out her hands for the bundle of sticks. Brandon handed them to her, and as he did, something caught his eye. He glanced down and felt his heart skip a beat. The woman's feet were wrong. They were facing the opposite direction, twisted unnaturally, as if her legs were broken and bent backward. A cold wave of fear washed over him, and he quickly looked up at her face. She was smiling, a small, eerie smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you for your help," she said, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the wind. Brandon's mind raced. What was going on? Was this some kind of prank? But the woman's smile, twisted and unnatural, made his blood run cold. Without saying a word, Brandon turned and bolted back up the road. He didn't stop running until he reached the guest house, his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally burst through the door, gasping for breath, the owner, Tom, looked up from the front desk in surprise. "Whoa, you okay, kid?" Tom asked, concerned. Brandon tried to catch his breath, his mind still racing. I just saw something," he stammered. There was a woman, her feet, they were backward. Tom's expression changed, his face growing more serious. He glanced at the other guests in the lobby before motioning for Brandon to follow him to the back office. Once they were alone, Tom sat down and sighed. "I was hoping you wouldn't run into her," he said quietly. Brandon stared at him in disbelief. "You knew about this?" "Who was she?" Tom rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "We don't talk about it much around here, especially not to tourists. But yeah, there's been stories. For years, people have claimed to see a woman wandering the roads late at night, carrying wood. Some say she's the ghost of a local woman who died in a tragic accident, but no one knows for sure." Brandon felt a chill run down his spine. "So, she's a ghost?" Tom shrugged. "That's one theory. Some say she's just a figment of people's imaginations, a hallucination brought on by the isolation and the cold. But you're not the first to see her, and you probably won't be the last." Brandon felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had come to Misty Ridge for adventure, but now he was terrified. The image of the woman's twisted feet and eerie smile was burned into his mind, and he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep that night. He thanked Tom for the information and headed back to his room, locking the door behind him. For the rest of the night, he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the window, half expecting to see the woman's face appear in the darkness outside. But she never came. The next day, Brandon canceled his plans. He stayed inside the guest house, too shaken to venture back into the town. He spent most of the day in the small lounge area, reading and trying to forget about what had happened. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. That night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. His mind was racing, replaying the encounter with the woman over and over again. Eventually, he drifted off, but his sleep was restless and filled with strange dreams. In one dream, he was back on the road, walking beside the woman. But this time, the road was different, older, more overgrown, as if it hadn't been used in decades. The trees were thicker, and the air was heavy with the scent of pine and earth. As they walked, the woman stumbled, dropping her bundle of sticks. She fell to the ground, hitting her head on one of the sticks with a sickening crack. Blood pooled beneath her, and she cried out for help, but there was no one around to hear her. Brandon tried to run to her, to help her, but his feet wouldn't move. He was frozen in place, watching helplessly as the woman bled out on the ground. When he woke, his heart was pounding, and his sheets were soaked with sweat. It took him a moment to realize it had all been a dream, but the fear lingered. He checked out of the guest house the next morning, eager to leave Misty Ridge behind. As he boarded the bus back to Denver, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the woman was still out there, somewhere, waiting for him. It wasn't until weeks later that Brandon had another dream about her. In this dream, she was walking down the road again, but this time she wasn't alone. Brandon was there too, walking beside her, carrying the bundle of sticks, and as they walked, she turned to him and smiled. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and distant, like a whisper on the wind. When he woke, the fear was gone, replaced by a strange sense of peace. He never saw the woman again, but the memory of that night in Misty Ridge stayed with him, a reminder that some things can't be explained, no matter how hard we try.